As you see all these different Occupy movements throughout the country, including here in Occupy LA, we get local coverage here in Los Angeles, and constantly the reporter's like, I don't get it. What is the Occupy movement about? I'm so confused. Well, I'm here to explain it to you. Well, one of the things that it's about is about the great injustice of the banks getting huge payouts, basically through our money, our collective money, and we get nothing, okay? Now, very ironically, the organization that has done a terrific news article on this is Bloomberg News, okay, which is not to be confused with the actions of Mayor Bloomberg. It is his company, so give him credit for running a company that ran this story, but obviously he has acted in a completely different way when it comes to Occupy Wall Street. But when you look at this story, you get an excellent sense of the great injustice. So let's get started. First of all, they looked through 29,000 pages of federal documents that they obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. That's because both the Bush administration and the Obama administration did not want to give this information over as to how much they had helped the banks. They said, oh, well, if the market knew, then the banks would be in bigger trouble. Well, then maybe they should have been in bigger trouble. And as you can see, they were going to get completely bailed out in ways that we had not even imagined. So everybody thinks that it was the TARP program that bailed out these banks, the money that was given through Treasury. In fact, that money was about $700 billion. What a lot of people did not know is that the Fed guarantees and the lending that they gave to the banks was actually far larger. It was to the tune of $7.77 trillion. Now, that's a nice jackpot. So the stuff that everybody's been concentrating on, TARP, is actually nickels and dimes compared to the actual money given out through the Fed. Okay. Now, a lot of times the banks will say, hey, look, those are just loans. We just got loans and then we paid them back. But we're going to show you in a minute how those loans, in fact, wound up making them billions of dollars in free money. So first, to give you a sense of the size of how much the Fed money mattered, if you look at Bank of America, they got $45 billion in TARP money. But they got $91.4 billion from the Fed. Citigroup, $45 billion from TARP, but $99.5 billion from the Fed. So what you see there is in both cases, they actually got twice as much money from the Federal Reserve that they got from the Treasury. So they want you to look at the Treasury money. They don't want you to look at the Fed money because that's where the real action is. Now, how about the 6 largest U.S. banks combined? Well, they got $160 billion from TARP, but they got $460 billion from the Fed. Again, a much, much larger amount. And how about the 6 banks compared to everyone else? Because over 700 banks got bailed out by the Fed, let alone the Treasury, right? So that, again, the real money's in the Fed. And of those, just the top 6 big banks, which are the best politically connected ones, they got 63% of the money. So if you're politically connected, you're JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, you got 63% of the booty. Now, while they were getting all that money, they were telling the public something else entirely. Bank of America's CEO, Kenneth Lewis, who was the CEO at the time in 2008, said that his bank, quote, was one of the strongest and most stable major banks in the world. On that same exact day, November 26th of 2008, when he was saying that, they had borrowed $86 billion from the central bank. That means if the Federal Reserve did not step in and loan them this tremendous amount of money, they would not be strong, they would not be stable, they would be bankrupt. Not a little bankrupt, utterly, completely, out of business bankrupt. Imagine you're running a business and you're like, oh, well, my business is going fairly well, except I just need an $86 billion loan. Not an $86 million, an $86 billion loan. And then you go out and tell the public, oh, I have a totally strong and stable bank. But he's not alone. Jamie Dimon, on March 26 of 2010, of course, the CEO of JP Morgan, said, at the request of the Federal Reserve to help motivate others to use the system, we took the money in. Basically saying, oh, I didn't need that TARP money. I didn't need the money from the Federal Reserve. I did it to help the Treasury and the Fed. I did it to help the other banks. Yeah, right. Here's the reality. That in reality, they had borrowed from the Fed twice as much cash as they had on hand. So they have a certain amount of money on hand, and they borrowed twice as much as that to make sure that they could survive. On top of that, at the time of their peak borrowing, they had $48 billion that they had taken in 2009 from the Federal Reserve. Again, that's a giant number. Now, part of it was to shore up the bank, but there was a second reason, because it was free money. As Jamie Dimon is saying, I don't need it. Meanwhile, a year after the original handouts began, he says, give me twice as much as I got in reserves. Give me $48 billion. Why? Because he's going to make a killing off of it, as we're about to show you in just a little bit. But now, let's look at where the big banks are, right? Before we show you how much money they made off that. Well, back in 2006, before any of this crisis began, they had $6.8 trillion in assets, okay? Well, after the great crash, they must have less, right? Of course not. They actually have significantly more. They have $9.5 trillion in assets today. That's a 39% increase. This crash that they started, that they caused, didn't hurt them at all. It wound up helping them. Why? Because they captured the government. We're going to show you the numbers behind that as well in a second. So what is their level of compensation today in last year in 2010? Well, they gave out $146 billion in compensation. That is on average for every worker at these top banks, $126,342. And that's a 20% increase from 2005. So their executives aren't doing worse after they caused this crash. They're doing significantly better. Why? Because they got free money. So finally, let me show you the free money that they got. The 190 firms that took this money from the Federal Reserve wound up making, in what they call net interest margin, $13 billion. So this is really important. Let me explain what that means. That means they get it from the Federal Reserve sometimes as low as 0.01%, where they basically they're paying nothing back to the Federal Reserve. They're almost getting it for free, right? But at the same time, they're lending it out, whether it's to businesses, whether it's back to the United States government in the form of treasury bonds. They're lending it out at much higher rates, 3%, 4%, sometimes 6%, sometimes 10%. And they get to keep what's in the middle. Now, if the government came to you and said, I'm going to give you, at the height of their borrowing on a single day, it was $1.2 trillion. If the government came and said, here, I'm going to give you $1.2 trillion, and then you go lend it out to people at whatever rates you like, well, then you would have made $13 billion. These guys aren't geniuses. They didn't come up with anything interesting or different or a unique product. What they did was they captured the government. And the government gave them a $13 billion gift that any of you could have made if you had that same advantage. And then they turn around and go, what are people complaining about? We gave some of the TARP money back. Yes, you might have given some of the TARP money back, but the real prize was the Federal Reserve money. And the real prize on that Federal Reserve money, even if you return it, even if you pay back the loans, is a $13 billion you get to put in your pocket on that difference in interest that you get to charge others. See, that's part of what Occupy Wall Street is mad about. They're saying, hey, you know what? Why did they get a free $13 billion from our money? And what did we get? We got nothing. Bernanke at the time said, we have to do this. If we don't do this, unemployment will be around 8 or 9%. I got news for you. It's at 9% anyway. So we got no benefit from it. Millions of houses have been foreclosed. We got no benefit from it. But the top 1%, the bank executives at those top 6 companies, made a tremendous amount of money. In fact, just the 6 large U.S. banks that we mentioned earlier, they basically got a free $4.8 billion, again, from that difference in interest, okay? So they get money at 0.01%, and they sell it back to people at 4%, 10%, et cetera, and they pocket, according to Bloomberg's calculations, nearly $5 billion. That is a gift from the American taxpayers. Now, how were they able to do this? Why did they get this free gift? Well, that's because, of course, of lobbying. The large banks did $22.1 million in lobbying in 2006. Then they ran into trouble. So what did they do? They ran out of money. They shouldn't have any money for lobbying, right? Any money they got was from us. No. Of course, since they bought the politicians, there was no strings attached, and they could continue to spend our money to lobby our politicians, in other words, to buy our politicians. So what did they do? They actually increased their lobbying. In 2010, they spent $29.4 million. That's a gain of 33% from just 4 years before that. So there's more lobbying than ever. Now, when you turn to the guy that they lobbied and lead among the Republicans in saying that TARP was absolutely necessary was Senator Judd Gregg, and he's now a former senator from New Hampshire. When they asked him about the Federal Reserve money that was given away, that was 10 times larger than the TARP money, he said, quote, "We didn't know the specifics." In other words, the implication. And every senator that Bloomberg News talked to said, oh, if we had only known, we would have done something totally different. My ass, he would have done anything different. One, I'm not convinced they didn't know. Number two, even if they didn't know and they just found out about the Fed, they wouldn't change anything. Why don't they change something right now? Now that you know, why don't you go get our $13 billion back? You're not going to do that because you work for the banks. You got paid by those banks. You got paid in campaign contributions. And you know what you're going to get paid in right now? Well, let's find out. Where's Senator Judd Gregg working today? He retired from the Senate and is now working for Goldman Sachs. That's how it works. Goldman Sachs says, I'll pay you in lobbying money. By the way, #1 contributor to Barack Obama in 2008. So both parties. And then #2, when you retire, I'll pay you millions on top for the excellent work you did on our behalf in getting us $13 billion extra overall for all the banks. So the couple of million that they pay Senator Judd Gregg to be a sellout and pretend he didn't know what was going on is well worth it to banks like Goldman Sachs. And that's how we get robbed. That's why there's an Occupy movement all across the country. And that's why the power establishment, whether it's the politicians or the banks, are dying to shut it down so you don't find out how much they robbed you.